Hey everyone, welcome to my new podcast, Bleep with Ana Navarro. And this week I give you a play-by-play on how the bleep I got here, how the bleep we got here as a country, all the bleeping things that may have happened this week, how the bleep we feel about it, and any other bleeping thing we feel like talking about. And so look, this podcast is a very new experience for me, and it's a very liberating experience, a little nerve-wracking, I will say. I'm used to being a co-host on The View. I'm used to being a political commentator on CNN. That means that I have a say in the topics that we talk about, but I'm not the decision maker. And a lot of times on TV, you get just a few minutes to talk about an issue, to react to an issue. Here we have much more time to break things down, to analyze things, to go through the emotions of what we're feeling about some of these things, to talk about the hope and the things that are giving us some optimism. And so I hope to take you through this journey. And I know there's a lot going on right now in our country, in the world. I know a lot of us feel a great deal of angst, of anxiety, of sadness. And so I'm hoping that this is a little bit cathartic, not just for me, but for you, and that we have a conversation every week about what's going on and how we feel about it and what we can do about it. Why this show and why now? Now, because frankly, this is an election year. There are less than 300 days to the midterm elections. And so I think it's very important that we are engaged with what's happening in the world and in our country, that we process it, that we channel whatever we're feeling about it to the ballot box, that we start organizing, that we start feeling inspired, and that we don't normalize or get numb to anything. All right, so let's press rewind for a bit. I want to give you a breakdown on how I got here before we tackle how our country got to where it is today. And I think this is important because I think all of us are who we are, plus our circumstances, plus our experiences. And for me, so much of what I lived and what I continue living has shaped not only who I am, but who I am politically and how I respond politically. So I came here when I was 8 years old, a little girl from Nicaragua. I came here as a refugee before I knew what that word meant. I came to political exile before I knew what that word meant. I came here because my parents chose to bring me here. It was not a choice they made easily, and it was not a choice they made happily. We had to flee a revolution. We had to flee a left-wing regime and dictatorship. It is an incredibly hard decision for an individual to make, for a family to make. And I think a lot of the people who make it are thinking about their kids, about the future, about not wanting their kids to be raised in a dictatorship. So yeah, I experienced regime change. I experienced it when I was 8 years old. And so much about what's happening in this country right now centers around immigration and immigration enforcement. I am an immigrant. And it's not an easy experience. For me, I've actually learned to process it now as I got older. Because when you come here when you're 8 years old, you're not thinking about it. You're not analyzing it. You're not, you're just doing. You're being a kid and you're trying to get used to these new circumstances. You may not understand why you are in these new circumstances. I'll tell you, my parents never sat me down and had a conversation about, okay, this is happening and we're going to get on a plane and we're going to go establish a new life in Miami, and now we are political exiles and we cannot go back to our country. I never had those conversations with my parents. It was a different generation where, you didn't have these conversations with your kids. And also, I think that it was a lot of unknowns. My parents didn't know how long this was going to last. my parents were always hoping that we would be back in Nicaragua in short order and that things would go back to some level of normalcy there. Well, 45 years later, here I am, feeling very much an American. Yes, Latina. Yes, a woman. Yes, an immigrant. And yes, an American. And I know that bothers some people. And some people don't want you to call yourself Nicaraguan American or Cuban American or fill in the blank, a hyphenated American. But you see, I think one of the beauties about America is that you can hold on to your traditions and your identity, and you can also be 100% American. Becky G, who I know and love, says it best. She says, I'm not 50% this or 50% that. I am a 200%er. I'm 100% of each. And that's how I feel about it as well. And that entire subject matter, the Civil War, the fight against the Sandinistas, that consumed my life growing up. We were hanging on every word and every news article, every piece of news that came out of what was happening in Nicaragua and that fight. And that explains why I became a Republican and why Ronald Reagan played such an important role in my life. So we come here in 1980, September. It was an election year. I didn't know it. I was 8 years old. But I do remember that everybody in my family, everybody I listened to, everybody who came in and out of my house, everybody in Miami, everybody was voting for Ronald Reagan. And large part of it was because Reagan was going to free Nicaragua. Reagan was going to free Cuba. Reagan was going to fight communism. Reagan was going to support the freedom fighters, and he was going to stand with the people who were being oppressed by these left-wing regimes. And I realized that, that it needs some historical context now. We were in the middle of a Cold War. And I think a lot of people were very unhappy with the way that Jimmy Carter had gone about it and saw in Ronald Reagan this cowboy on a horse that was going to save us from these dictators and we were going to be able to go home. And so that's all I knew about Ronald Reagan growing up. That's all I knew about the Republican Party growing up. I don't think at that age I even knew that there was a Republican Party and a Democratic Party. I just knew that Ronald Reagan was going to take us to the promised land. Today, as an adult, things are much more nuanced. Things are much more complex. There were good things about Ronald Reagan. There were bad things about Ronald Reagan. But when I was an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid listening to Ronald Reagan's speeches and listening to Ronald Reagan speak at the State of the Union and say that he was a freedom fighter too, that's all I needed to hear. That was the one issue that in my household, that in my community, that was the one issue we cared about, and that was the issue he was speaking to. So I became a Republican. When I did understand about partisanship and when I did understand about political engagement, I immediately became a Republican. That is what everybody around me was. And also, the Republicans that represented South Florida were just a completely different class of human beings than what we know now as Republicans. It was people like Jeb Bush. It was people like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, the first Latina congresswoman elected. It was people like Lincoln Diaz-Balart. These people would stand in Congress and would represent their constituency, and that meant me. And they could speak in Spanish, and I could understand what they were saying, and they cared about our fight for freedom. A far cry from the Republicans that are in power now. Ronald Reagan, why were Republicans as well? Listen, I became a legal permanent resident and I became a U.S. citizen thanks to the Immigration Reform Act that was passed and signed by Ronald Reagan. in 1996. It's called 1986. So why did I also love and admire Reagan? I became a U.S. citizen because of Ronald Reagan. When we first came to the country, we applied for political asylum. So I know what it's like to go through the arduous process. It was difficult. It was years of wait. It was going in front of judges. And I'm talking back in the 1980s. It's much worse today. And then all of a sudden, as our political asylum claim was making its way through the system, there was an amnesty. There was an amnesty. That word that has become a bad word today with Republicans, well, Ronald Reagan signed an amnesty law in 1986. And my family became legal permanent residents and then citizens thanks to that amnesty law passed by Ronald Reagan. It was referred to as the Simpson-Masoli law. Later in my years, I met Alan Simpson, who was a senator from Wyoming, and got to thank him for that. So I owe my legal status in this country to Ronald Reagan. And, part of that legal process that we went through has shaped my life so much. I think so many of my views on immigration are as a result of what we went through. I was never here. I personally was never in this country without status because my parents had money and they were able to send me to a private school. And that meant that I could be here with a student visa and remain in status as our political asylum was making its way through the system as we applied for amnesty law. So I never fell out of status because if you go to a private school, you can get the special student visa. But for the grace of God, I could have been a Dream Act kid. And that's why when we talk about the Dreamers, it is so close to my heart. And it is an issue that I am passionate and emotional about. Because I know what it's like to be an 8-year-old kid who has no agency to make your own decisions and gets brought to this country by your parents, not by any fault of your own. And you don't know if you're here legally or illegally. You don't know what any of that means. And so, yes, I think we owe those young people who are today fully immersed in America, who are Americans in every way except legally, we owe them to stop using them as political pawns and to find a solution for these folks. So that's basically the story of how I made it to this country. I think that's the story of why I became a Republican, of why politics was so important to me. Now I want to tell you a little bit about when I stopped voting for Republicans. Well, welcome back. But before we continue, I should do something I should have done at the beginning, which is introduce you to Chacha. I gotta tell you, a lot of people think she's a stuffed animal because she's so well behaved. And she will be here most weeks. She's used to listening to her mother talk and rant and just behaving. So let's pick up where we left off. I was telling you of why I had become a Republican and why I stayed a Republican for so much of my life. Part of it was because of people like John McCain. I had the honor of my life in 2008. John McCain asked me to be his National Hispanic Chair for his presidential campaign. And I loved the guy. I loved him at hello. He was authentic. He had strong opinions. He was well informed about so many of the issues I cared about. He cussed. He drank. He was fun. He was honest. He was loyal. I mean, there were so many things about him that just inspired me. He really cared about public service. It was the center of his life since he was born into a family of service that had served their country. He was a war hero. He was somebody that inspired me and taught me so many lessons. I miss him terribly today. I miss even the sound of his voice, but more than the physical sound and literal sound of his voice, I miss his voice in the American debate. And with John, I got to travel with that campaign. I got to travel the United States, go to places and cities I had never been, and do things I had never imagined I would do. And after I finished that campaign, after John lost, I was there the night of the concession speech at the Arizona Biltmore Hotel. It was a very sad night, but it was also a night where John McCain showed class, showed that in America we accept election results, was conciliatory, and genuinely wished Barack Obama good luck. Before working for John, before doing this in the John McCain campaign, I had been involved in local campaigns in Miami and congressional campaigns in Miami, state campaigns. I worked for Jeb Bush when he became governor for 5 whole minutes, hated each and every one of them. Really could never get used to living in Tallahassee or the chain of command and the bureaucracy that comes with working in inside of government. And yeah, Tallahassee was hard for me because in Miami, I get to Tallahassee and I remember going to the supermarket for the first time and seeing this sign on one of the aisles. It said ethnic section. It's like, and I get to the ethnic section and there's like Taco Bell shells and Chi-Chi's salsa, and that was about it. It was the ethnic section was maybe 2 feet wide. Well, I was used to living in Miami where the entire place, the entire supermarket is an ethnic section. It was a very difficult cultural shift for me that I did not do well on. But going back to McCain, I love the guy. And after I finished that campaign, because of that campaign, I got on national TV a lot. I was a campaign surrogate. So I'd go on different networks and different radio and TV programs on behalf of the campaign. That brought me to CNN. After John lost, CNN kept calling me to come in and give commentary. And I got to say, at first, it was incredibly flattering, right? You get there and you get hair and you get makeup, and I had false eyelashes, and my mom's friends would call her and tell her they'd just seen me on TV, and my mom was so proud. It was great. And then one day I realized that this was really time consuming and I was making no money. It was costing me more money than it was giving me. And so I told CNN, if you want me to keep coming back, you got to start paying me. And to my shock, they did. And that was the start of my life as a pundit and as a political commentator and contributor on CNN, where I've been now well over a decade. And as a pundit on CNN, I was the staunch Republican Hispanic pundit for CNN. And then Donald Trump started to run. I had supported every Republican running for president before that, every Republican voting for anything before that. And then Donald Trump comes down that escalator, and the first thing he says is calling Mexicans rapists and criminals. And that just hurt my heart because I understood at that moment that he was giving free rein to stereotypes, racist tropes and stereotypes. And I also understood that where I think a lot of other Hispanics, or some Hispanics may not have, because you would say, well, he's talking about Mexicans. Why do you care? Well, because I understand that for a large, first of all, just talking that way about Mexicans in itself is wrong. But if that wasn't enough, I also understand that there's a lot of racist people in this country who think that Latin America is just one big Mexico. There's little Mexicos, there's mid-sized Mexicos, and there's big Mexicos. And that for people who are who see Latinos as that, as rapists and criminals, it doesn't matter if you came here as a political exile or you came here as an economic refugee. It doesn't matter if you came here in 1960 or 1980 or in 2010. It doesn't matter if you are a criminal or if you are a hardworking, decent person contributing to this country. None of that matters. What matters is the color of your skin. What matters is your accent. What matters is the vowels in your last name. And so when you give free rein to racism, racists usually don't leave racism in a little box. When people are bigoted and a precedent or a person in power emboldens that, it's not just about Mexicans. It's not just about Nicaraguans. It's not just about Cubans. It's not just about Somalis. It's usually about a much larger swath of people. And it's wrong. It is wrong if it's about one person or if it's about 100 million people. Racism is wrong. I had never really been as sensitive to racism because I was raised in Miami. And in Miami, so many of the people in power, so much of the establishment, so much of the corporate elite look like me and sound like me and have similar stories like mine. But all of a sudden, you start traveling the country and it hit me. It hit me what was happening. I remember as a young kid, one time I was in my 20s, probably speaking at a political event, and I remember the question was asked to the panel. It was a political panel, and the question was asked of Latinos, of Hispanics. Do you remember the first time you were discriminated? And everybody on that panel went into great detail, really moving stories about the first time they had felt discriminated against. Some of them, it was in grade school. Some of them was in their school playground. And I'm sitting there sweating BBs. My palms begin to sweat because I can't remember a story. I can't remember a single time that I had been discriminated. So comes my turn and I say, listen, I'm a Latina. I'm a woman. I'm an immigrant. I got an accent. I'm chubby. The likelihood that I've been discriminated is 100%. But I'm so fucking arrogant, I probably didn't realize it. And so racism is something that I think in a place like Miami, I was able to be oblivious to and ignore. But as I went out into this country, as I went out into this world, as my pond got bigger, I realized the problem that it is and the harm that it causes. So let's go back to Donald Trump, shall we? So he comes down the escalator. He talks about Mexicans, calls them rapists and criminals. And then he goes on to do so many things. Honestly, Donald Trump was like, I always thought to myself, my God, if he had made a list of things that he could say and do to make me not vote for a Republican, to make me break with the party, to make me denounce this Republican nominee, Donald Trump could not have done a better job. It was like if he had a list of things he could do and say to piss me off. I remember being at the first Republican debate, Republican primary debate in 2016. It was at the arena where the Cavaliers play in Cleveland. Huge place. And there was a bunch of people on the stage because there was a bunch of people running at the time. That was that famous debate where Megyn Kelly asked him about calling women names. And Megyn Kelly said to him, "You've called women fat, slobs, pigs." And he answered, "Yeah, but that was just Rosie O'Donnell." So I was holding my phone on my lap, and my phone began vibrating. And when I looked down, it was a text from Rosie. And Rosie, who is my friend, who I'd met on The View, was saying to me, I'm watching this debate right now with my children. How do I explain what just happened to them? I couldn't explain it to her. The entire arena had laughed when he answered that, when he said, yeah, but that's just Rosie O'Donnell. Then we saw him mock a disabled reporter. That hit me like a ton of bricks right in my chest. I have a severely disabled brother. My brother Daniel is self-injurious autistic. He's got the mental and motor skills of an 11-month-old kid. He doesn't speak. He can't feed himself. He makes strange gestures and sounds. He's now in his 60s. But I grew up watching kids, when we would be out with Daniel, stare at him and mimic his gestures, mimic his sounds. I had never in my life seen an adult, much less an adult wanting to be the leader of the free world, mimicking and mocking and doing the gestures of somebody with a disability. I cannot think of something that denotes more cruelty and immaturity and stupidity and lack of leadership and moral compass than doing that. Picking on the vulnerable amongst us just for a laugh, just for fun, just to make a point. I mean, that's just something that to me was incredibly unacceptable. That wasn't enough. Then I remember one time Donald Trump had done an interview, and he was going through a legal case. This was during the campaign. And the judge, his name was Judge Curiel. He was Mexican-American. He was an American judge whose parents were from Mexico, who descended from Mexican immigrants. And when Trump got asked about him, Trump's answer was, oh yeah, he's a Mexican. As if completely discounting the fact that this man had gone to law school, worked hard, become a judge, and was able to be a judge. Yeah, none of that mattered. The only thing that he cared was he was just a Mexican. And that day I was in Washington and I was going to CNN, and I got into a car. I got into a taxi cab, and the taxi driver recognized me by my voice. Taxi drivers in places like Washington, D.C. keep CNN on in their cars all the time. And they may not know what I look like, but they knew what I sounded like. And he was an Ethiopian taxi driver, I remember. And he told me he'd come here from Ethiopia. And he said he had 3 children. He told me he worked as a taxi driver 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, to put his children through college. And so his children could be professionals. And he said to me, so does this mean that in Donald Trump's America, no matter how hard I work to make my children professionals, all they're going to be designated and labeled as they're just Ethiopians? And that hit me so hard. Went on CNN, Wolf Blitzer's show later that day, and just blasted what Trump had done. And then there was Access Hollywood. Oh, wait, before Access Hollywood, he attacked John McCain. He said John McCain was not a hero. He said he liked people who hadn't been captured. I mean, really, the idea of a guy who dodged the draft, calling John McCain, who basically hung from his thumbs for 5 years at the Hanoi Hilton, was tortured. Every day of his life after that, John lived in pain. John couldn't lift his hands, his arms above his shoulders. John couldn't brush the top of his own head. John suffered so much emotionally and physically, though he never complained and he never talked about it, for serving his country. And for Donald Trump to belittle John McCain and attack him was just, so disgusting. And it wasn't the first time he was going to do it or the last time he was going to do it. In that same campaign, we saw him attack a Gold Star family whose son had died serving our country because he was a Muslim. And then there was the Access Hollywood stuff. Still to this day, I will never understand. I will go to my deathbed not understanding how in the hell a majority of women and a majority and Christians and people of moral compass in America could have voted for a man who we heard and saw on video boast about sexual assault. I, to this day, refuse to normalize that, to forget it, or to understand it. And that's how I came to, for the first time in my life, vote for a Democrat candidate for president. I voted for Hillary Clinton. It wasn't easy. It was hard. I got to tell you, I had an absentee ballot in my suitcase that I carried around for weeks. For weeks. In Florida, they send you your absentee ballot like a month before the election. I put this in my suitcase and I schlepped it. That absentee ballot had probably platinum status on American Airlines that traveled to so many cities. Because it was really hard for me to bring myself to not vote Republican. And for a long time, I used to say that I was going to write in a candidate. I used to say I was going to write in my mother's name. I used to say that on TV, and it would upset my mother greatly. I think she was like genuinely nervous she might get elected. So I just couldn't, though. I could not vote for Donald Trump. I didn't care that the letter behind his name was Republican. I didn't care that most of the people around me in my community were going to vote for him. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it in 2016. I couldn't do it in 2020. I couldn't do it in 2024. But that was the first time, and my hand was shaking when I filled it out. And I realized I couldn't just write in somebody because I was in Miami. I was in Florida. Remember back when Florida was a purple state and a presidential election was decided because of Florida and because of 534 votes in Florida? That happened in the year 2000. So as a Floridian in 2016, I didn't have the luxury of throwing away my vote. And also just morally, that's kind of so lazy and not acceptable to me. Kind of cowardly. So I voted. I voted for Hillary Clinton. I would do it 10 times over today. But that's the story of how I became a Republican, why I stayed a Republican, and why, for the first time, and since then, have not voted Republican. So listen, there was 100 reasons in 2016 for me to vote against Trump. There were even more reasons for me to vote against Trump in 2020. He had targeted immigrants and the Latino community, maligned us so much. There were even more reasons in 2024. By then, we'd seen January 6th. Forget Access Hollywood, as if that wasn't bad enough. How anybody could vote for Trump after January 6th is another thing I will never understand. And look, things are not good. Things are not good in this country. I knew things were going to be bad for the Latino community and the immigrant community. I didn't know they were going to be this bad. I didn't know we were going to see masked, armed men shooting people in cars, dragging pregnant women through the streets, deporting 4-year-old cancer victims, detaining U.S. citizens, creating a state of terror in this country. I didn't know that we were going to get to a point where people were going to have to go out and protest law enforcement. Law enforcement, if that's what we're calling ICE. And what's happened in Minneapolis, that's been a year in the making. It's been the maligning of the immigrant community. It has been arbitrary targeting of immigrants. He said he was going to go against and deport the worst of the worst. In some cases, he's deporting the best of the best. And it's not only who he's deporting. It's not only the fact that he's lying about deporting people with criminal records. It's how they're going about it. It's the purposeful spectacle of cruelty. It is the masks. It is the arms. It is the chasing of anybody that looks brown or has an accent. It is that the Supreme Court of the United States has basically legitimized racial profiling, getting killed by an ICE agent. But I'll tell you what inspires me. In America, we give a shit. We give a shit about others, not just about ourselves. In America, we give a shit when somebody is abusing power. In America, we give a shit when we see people treated worse than we would allow animals to be treated. In America, we give a shit when we see violations of the Constitution. And so that gives me hope. Large crowds gathering in Minneapolis. Guys, it's like, freezing weather and it's snow, and this is not like protesting in Miami in January. This is protesting in Minneapolis in January. And despite the fact that these people have a reason to be fearful, right? Scores of people from Minneapolis showed up to say, we are not going to take it. Showed up to say, you should be ashamed about what happened and what you're doing. And to quote the mayor of Minneapolis, get the fuck out of our city. And you see, that kind of impromptu outrage that leads to action is one of the things about this country that inspires me and that I think makes us so unique and makes us American, and something that I hope to tap into in this podcast, something that I hope we all find within ourselves as we go through. So that's where we are. By the way, not every podcast is going to be this heavy. I think talking about my childhood and exile and revolution, those are kind of heavy duty things. I hope to have laughs. I hope to have guests. Maybe a couple of other dogs can join us every now and then. Maybe one day we'll drink. Maybe one day we'll eat. What I do want the running theme to be is that we each have a role to play. We can all do something. We each have a platform, and we've got to channel that energy. We got to channel the anger and turn it into real action. Well, thank you for being here on my first podcast. You know what? Go ahead and rate us, but also leave us a message. Leave me a message. I would love to hear from you. I'd like to hear about what you want us to talk about, what you want to see in this podcast, and what's giving you hope, and how you're going to do your duty and make a difference as an American. See you next week. Bleep with Ana Navarro is a Hyphenate Media Group production in partnership with iHeart's My Cultura Podcast Network. For more of your favorite shows, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.